Hey everyone, today I'm going to explain how drugs work. Drugs are essentially small molecules that bind to important proteins and molecules inside of your body, usually proteins or enzymes inside of your body. And how they usually work is by inhibiting the function of those proteins or enzymes. Let's say there's an enzyme in your body that's involved in breaking down a certain molecule. Well, a drug will bind to that enzyme and prevent that enzyme from working. Let's say you have too much dopamine in your brain. Your dopamine receptors are a little bit overactive. You might have a drug that binds to dopamine receptor and which is a protein, and prevents dopamine from binding to that same receptor. So essentially, what are drugs? Drugs are small molecules that bind to your important proteins and prevent the function of your proteins. If the drug blocks a protein in your heart, you're gonna have a regulation in your heart. If the drug blocks a protein in your brain, you're going to have some kind of regulation in your brain. If the drug blocks something to do with a stomach enzyme or a digestive enzyme, you're going to have some kind of regulation of that enzyme. If it's a pump of some kind in the stomach and that drug is going to block that pump, it's going to prevent the acid from being produced in your stomach. So depending on the drug depending on the target of that drug, you're going to have different regulation. Now, here's the problem with some drugs. You may have heard of side effects. So how do side effects work? Well, let's say there is a drug that you need to take to regulate some protein in your brain. Okay, so what should this drug do? This drug should bind to a protein in your brain, a specific protein that does something in your brain to, I don't know, help you with anxiety or mood or something like that. But what if that same inhibitor, what if that little molecule also bound to an important protein in your heart? You see, now it would block that heart protein, and suddenly you may have a heart issue, you may have a heart attack or something. That's what a side effect is. A side effect usually has to do with a drug that should be binding to one protein in your body, but now it's got these other targets that it's binding to. And the reason for that is simple. A lot of drugs, when they're developed, they're not developed to specifically target one protein. There's no way to take a protein, like a brain protein, and develop a drug and design it on a computer to where that drug binds specifically to that one protein and nothing else ever. Instead, the way drugs are developed usually is some scientist, some researcher will find an important protein for some physiological process like brain function or heart function or kidney function. Let's say there is a new protein, and this protein is involved in diabetes, right? So drug manufacturers might want to make a drug that targets that protein so that you can alleviate some insulin resistance or something. So what they'll do is they'll take a library of 1 million different, or hundreds of thousands, or tens of thousands at least, different molecules. They've got these libraries of little molecules that they've already made, all these random little molecules. And what they'll do is they'll just blast them and search which ones of these little molecules bind to this protein of interest, this protein that's involved in insulin resistance. They'll find maybe out of that million molecule library, they'll find maybe 5 molecules that bind to this particular protein. Then what they'll do is they'll test it in animals, maybe in rodents or something, and this is the FDA process. I'm not fully familiar with the FDA process, but as far as I know, you start with cell culture, then you move up to smaller animals and larger animals, and ultimately to humans. And what you're testing for is that the drug that you've screened for out of millions of different drugs that you think binds only to this particular protein you're interested in for insulin stuff. You're trying to show that it only binds to that and regulates that, and it doesn't bind to, say, a heart protein or a brain protein or some other important protein in the body, because that would be bad, right? You don't want to regulate things other than the target you want. And so they'll do screens in smaller animals, and they'll move up to larger animals and humans, and then they'll figure out, well, most people can take this drug, and for the most part it binds to this target protein, and it only regulates that insulin protein, right? But the problem comes in, all of us have a slightly different genetic makeup, right? So my proteins might be a little different shape than your proteins. So in my body, maybe I take this drug to regulate my insulin. What if that drug also binds to one of my important heart proteins? You see what could happen there? Now, instead of regulating my insulin stuff, it's doing that, but now it's also erroneously binding to one of my heart proteins, and that could cause heart failure, heart attack, stroke. So you see, that's how side effects happen. Side effects happen when these drugs that should be targeting one thing in my body are actually targeting that thing and another thing in my body, something that they shouldn't be. If they target something in my brain erroneously, then I have a stroke or I have some kind of neural problem. If it targets my heart erroneously, I might have a heart attack. If it targets something in my liver, I might have liver failure or liver problems, you see? So that's what these side effects are. Side effects are when drugs that should be targeting something in your body are targeting more than one thing in that body, because, again, drugs aren't perfect. A lot of drugs aren't perfect. They're not designed specifically to only bind to that target that they're targeting. In different people's genetic backgrounds, it is possible that perhaps it could bind to something other than the target, and that's when problems happen. So hopefully this gives you some insight into how drugs work. A lot of them are inhibitors for proteins. They bind to and inhibit the function of protein, and depending on where that protein works in your body, you're going to have different results. The problem comes when those inhibitors aren't just binding to that target you're hoping they're binding to. Maybe in your genetic background, or your particular circumstance, it's binding to a different protein. You have these complications, and that could lead to all these side effects that we've heard about. And that's why when you see those drug commercials, they say in some cases may cause hemorrhaging, heart attacks, sudden death, all of these different things, because it very well may, depending on what that drug is doing in your particular body. So hopefully this gives you some insight, some perspective. Please leave a like, a thumbs up below. And as again, thanks for watching, and see you next time.